Hello and welcome to this special Bharatvaarta podcast. I'm your host Amit Paranspe, and I'm here with my very good friend Dr. Uday Kulkarni. Some of our Bharatvaarta hosts will remember that we had a conversation, me and Uday, a few months back as well on his earlier book, and it gives me great pleasure to talk about his latest book I have here, the Maratha Century. Over the next 45-50 minutes, we hope to talk to him about this interesting new book. Hopefully, we will answer some of the questions that I have received from some people already through Twitter and through other formats. Without much ado, let's get to it. But I'll do a very brief introduction of Dr. Kulkarni. Many of you may already know him, but Dr. Uday Kulkarni is a retired Navy surgeon. He is a graduate of the Armed Forces Medical College. He served in the Indian Navy for many years. After that, he has served in private practice as a surgeon. And over the last 10 plus years, he has authored over 6 very interesting books on Maratha history, starting with the Solstice at Panipat, followed by the Era of Baji Rao. Then he compiled a Bakhar of Panipat from original sources. His most recent book, the Maratha Century that we're going to talk about, prior to that, he wrote a magnum opus, if I were to call it, on Nana Peshwa, which is a 700-800 page book, extremely detailed. This book is actually going to be very interesting because one of the feedback that I have received, and I'm sure Dr. Kulkarni has received from many of his readers, is while everyone is very happy that Dr. Kulkarni has brought Maratha history, especially 18th century Maratha history, which was not talked about in our history books, in popular discussions for a long time, in the forefront. And while that is good, some of his history books have been extremely thorough, extremely well researched and detailed. And for a casual reader, one of the feedback is, oh, that book is great, but it's too overwhelming for me. That's a feedback I have received. I don't find it that way because I'm a big history fan. For those people who thought that they're interested in history, but these detailed books are too overwhelming, this current book is going to be a great solution for them, because what this book does is give the reader a very good snapshot, and we'll hear a lot more about it, from the interesting beginnings of the Maratha century. The Maratha century itself is the 18th century that is the focus of the book. The book goes back to the 17th century when Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj established the Hindavi Swarajya, and which was the foundation of what happened later on in the 18th century. And it covers the first few decades of the 19th century as well, which was towards the end of the Maratha Empire when the British finally took over. So that's what this book is about, and it covers this entire period in small chapters. And each of them can be read independently. Some of them are historic, some of them are more, I would say, talking about various incidents that happened during that era, and are good, interesting short reads for people. So let's hear more about it. Dr. Kulkarni, once again,
hello,
welcome to Bharatvaarta podcast, and let's get straight to it. I have a bunch of questions lined up, but before that, would like to hear from you about the book and what led you to working on this specific book.
Actually, perhaps this should have been the first book that I wrote. But at that point in time, I don't think it would have sold that much as it sells today. Because it's a custom to first give an overview of the entire period that you plan to write about, and then go into details in each segment as you proceed further. So it's only after writing 5 books, 2 translations, and so on, that I could finally get around to doing this, because I felt that unless I kind of have one book in which I tell the entire story of 175 years, which was actually the expanse of the Maratha period, or the Maratha Empire, or the Maratha Power, or the Maratha Confederacy, so many words, starting from the mid 17th century and extending till the first quarter of the 19th century. Actually, looking at the length of this period, it is almost as long as the Mughal period, which started probably, rather than, I would say, from Babur to Humayun, and then there was a gap of 15 years before Akbar came back. So if you even take it from Akbar's time, 1556, till, I would say that when the Marathas took over from the Mughals became a cipher and practically a phantom king in Delhi. So even if you consider this period, even if you go up to 1857, you find it is 200 years. And this actually works out from the first fort that Chhatrapati Shivaji took in 1646 till the end of the empire in 1818. You find it works out to nearly 175 years. So both have been at the same time. However, somehow the way we have been introduced to history of India it has been from a Delhi-centric point of view. And second part of it is that what are the monuments various empires left behind? So today, if you talk about the Satavahanas or the Rashtrakutas, there are hardly any monuments they left behind. Probably Ellora caves would be one in the Rashtrakuta period. But other than that, it's very difficult to identify for a lay person with a particular empire. So the buildings that Marathas built were mostly on the forts. And the palaces that they built on the cities that they controlled were very simple affairs. They were not the majestic buildings which would make them as very famous as major empire builders and so on. So that has an impact too. So two things. One is being Delhi-centric. One is what monuments leave behind. And the way history was taught. So-and-so's period, so-and-so's period. And then you find that in between there's a passing note about Chhatrapati Shivaji somewhere, and the 18th century is kind of dismissed out of hand because suddenly you find that there's a Battle of Plassey which appears in your textbooks, and then you start with the British period. So this was the perception which I found it very wrong in a way. And I wanted to correct that because I'm not the only person who says that. I mean, eminent people, Grant Duff said it for the first time that we inherited our empire as early as 1826 from the Marathas. It was also repeated by Justice Ranade around 1900 in his book, The Rise of the Maratha Power. When he wrote that he took it over from this, except for Bengal and the parts of the Carnatic, all the other rules were already established under the Maratha power. And again, it was written by a man called G.W. Stevens. On the fold of my cover or jacket, there's a quote about the rebellious Pune, where he mentions that why the Marathas feel the loss of, and why Pune is such a rebellious place. All the freedom fighters that came up in the 19th century, the 20th century, most of them till Lokmanya Tilak were from Pune. So he explains that it was the Marathas who lost their empire to us. It was we who brought them from masters to slaves. And other powers, it was a change of masters. But for the Marathas, it was from being the ruling power to being a subordinate to another power. So that kind of pinched them. And that is what... So these are admitted by a few stray authors in between. But after 1857, the entire stress shifted to Delhi. And again, in the early part of the 20th century, when the capital of the British was shifted from Calcutta to Delhi, once again, Delhi came into prominence rather than anything else. And that is where the government ruled from. So it was Delhi that became the focus of Indian history. The second thing is that early part of the 18th century, you find the Marathas go to Delhi. They change emperors on the force of their armies. Baji Rao reaches Delhi in 1737, Baji Rao Peshwa. And again, in 1740s, 1750s, 1760s, the Maratha influence in Delhi keeps growing. The emperor is a poor, helpless soul who depends either on his wazir or on the Maratha soldiers to bail him out every time he's under some kind of a threat. So with all this put together, it was necessary to put this put it in front of the national consciousness, I would call it, that this was a Maratha century. Now, when I say Maratha century, obviously it is more than 100 years. So the title of the book is more figurative than literal, which I have mentioned in my preface. That is what the theme of the Maratha century. Now, putting this entire story in one book is no easy task because there are so many details and so many minor points that you really cannot include them all. So I decided the format of the book will be in the form of vignettes. You get the most important points, the high points or the low points, which happened in those 175 years in the form of either historical events or in the form of small vignettes. Like there's a chapter on the grand wedding, which Nana Phadnavis organized for Sawai Madhavrao Peshwa. What kind of weddings were organized that time? How was he greeting the guests, for example? So he tells his persons who are appointed there that you must apply the gandha or the sectorial mark on the forehead. It should be exact in the center. None of the gandha or the saffron powder should fall on the nose. So these kind of minute details are mentioned in this letter. What should be the distance between each plates? Where should the lamps be placed? The senior dignitaries, what kind of lamp should be placed? Every alternate plate. The juniors who come, the lamp should be placed every 4. So the betel nut should be provided. How should the transport be given to people when they go home? So these kind of nuances bring out the cultural background of the Maratha century. So I wanted to bring those things out. Like there is a story of Khunya Murlidhar. So these kind of anecdotes you don't just see a 2-dimensional picture of an empire, but you go into the depth of it, the way people were living. And that I felt was very important. So these vignettes and these small anecdotes which came into the book were basically to give people a look behind the scenes, not just the procession of rulers. They won this battle, won that battle, but what was happening behind? What's the people like? What were they living like? What kind of life they had? So these are the things which I wanted to portray in this book. So from that point of view, that's the format decided. And then I said that it should not exceed 300 pages. And I exactly hit the dot at 300. And so I could stop writing it there. So that was the purpose.
No, I think that's, you mentioned vignettes. And I think that is key because what I was mentioning at the beginning of this conversation, that the detailed books, history books, while interesting to a history fan or to a historian, get too much into dates and into battles and into treaties and into correspondence. Whereas a history book for a layperson or for a casual reader needs to go more into the culture, the life, how various things were, how cities were planned, what kind of food people had. And this book provides a lot of those vignettes. And I think it gives a nice peek into the life of 18th century. But you also mentioned three things, and I think I'm going to reiterate that. First is our view of history is been very Delhi-centric, and this needs to be repeated again and again because that's been a mistake that has been done, and I think the British started it, but there's no excuse for why we didn't fix it after 1947. So all of us, all over India, even in state boards, learn a lot more about the Mughals than we learn about our dynasties. You mentioned the Satavahanas and the Rashtrakutas and the Chalukyas. Maharashtra, I mean, even before the Marathas, if you go back 2000 years or 1500 years or 1000 years, has such a rich history that is not well discussed. So I think that is a very important perspective. The other second point that you mentioned is 18th century is somehow just sort of muddled somewhere in popular history today. It's almost like the British took control of India from the Mughals, right? The power transition from Mughals to the British. The Marathas didn't exist. The Plassey battle many times in 1757 is considered a milestone. Recently, I also heard a senior journalist, author talk about the fact that how the Maratha Empire pretty much was over after Panipat, that is 1761. And that's entirely incorrect. If you read any of your books, especially this book, you'll realize that the Maratha Empire continued for at least 6 decades after that, right? Till the British finally took charge. So I think all these points, correcting all these points is extremely important. And this book does a phenomenal job of doing that without being too overbearing on the reader. I'm just going to read 3 lines from the back cover of the book because it summarizes things beautifully. It reads, the Marathas began their quest for Swarajya in 1646 under Chhatrapati Shivaji. From this year until 1818, the Marathas remained a formidable power in the Indian subcontinent. This is a story of their rise to paramountcy from the 17th century and their fall in the 19th century. It was the first indigenous empire. I think that's a very important point. After centuries of foreign rule, literally after 500, 600, 700 years, and the last before the British took over, right? So I think it was a very, very critical period in Indian history. A look at the stirring saga of 175 years. So I think that's exactly what it is. So let's briefly, I want to walk through some of the chapters. I'm obviously not going to cover all of them, and not some of the very popular ones that you have already talked about in your earlier books. But let's briefly talk about how all of this started, right? And of course, the top credit for all of this has to go to Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj, who established Swarajya around the middle of 17th century. So can you take us back to what Maharashtra was when Chhatrapati Shivaji was growing up, and what he saw around him, and what could have been the potential factors that led him to, do the great things that he eventually ended up doing?
I think when he was growing up, Maharashtra was a state which was divided between the Bahmani, the Nizam Shahi, and the Mughals who were coming from the north. So around the year 1600 was the first time when Ahmednagar was taken over by the Mughals, and Pune, which was the Jagir of Shahji Raje Bhosle, was kind of sandwiched between these southern and northern paths. And that is what was bequeathed to the young Shivaji Maharaj when he came here in 1642. And it was his mother actually who must be given the credit for the kind of education he received in his childhood. As early as 1646, when he was just 16, he wrote his seal because he was a prince and he had a seal, and it was the first seal in Sanskrit. All the seals, including that of his father, were in Persian until that point in time. So this was a statement in itself why I am making the seal, and the contents of the seal were also very important. That this seal of Shivaji shines for the benediction of all. That's the last line of it. It does not claim any particular segment of the people that he covered. Second thing he perceived was that the people of his region were oppressed, and the oppression was in the form of social oppression, it was political oppression, it was religious oppression, economic oppression. And when he saw this, he realized that this can only be defeated by having self-rule or Swarajya. And that was the first time actually the word you find in Marathi being used, Swarajya, as opposed to Pararajya. Now, Pararajya is the opposite in the sense that it's foreign rule or a rule by a foreigner. In all Marathi letters, you find that the foreigner is mentioned as either Mlencha or is mentioned as a Yavana. Of course, Yavana comes from Ionian, which is got a space in Turkey today. These people, when they came into India, they did not shed their, like several peoples have entered India, and entire world is made of migrations, I would say. So when they entered India, they continued with the traditions, the language of where they came from. And again, in their hierarchy, like there's an author of Aligarh Muslim University named Athar Ali, who's written a wonderful book about who are the Mansabdars in the Mughal period. And he says that the topmost Mansabdars were those who had Persian or Turkic ancestry. So that was the hierarchy and the pecking order in that period. The octroi charge, for example, on the local Hindu population was much lower than even the Europeans. So that kind of injustice was perceived. Social oppression was there. It was second-rate status accorded to the indigenous people. And all this kind of influenced the young Chhatrapati Raja Shivaji's mind. And that is probably what led to this urge to form your own self-rule and your own Swarajya. It is very interesting, but there's a traveler, Abbe Carey, who's Frenchman, who traveled through Maharashtra from Bijapur. He came to Chaul, which is on the western coast. And there he met a Maratha Killedar around the year 1673. And he reports a conversation he had with his Maratha Killedar at that point in time. And I quote, he says, I then asked him about Shivaji, his master. And he told me that hero intended to push his conquest from the river Indus, which forms the boundary of the region of Cambay, to the Ganga, far beyond the rich provinces of Bengal. So, I mean, Deccan was a given. In 1673, he already had much of the Deccan under his control. So what he was talking about is from the Indus to Bengal. That is his aim in 1673, where he wants to stretch out his kingdom. So this was the vision which was given. And repeatedly in the 18th century, you find letters harking back to Nana Peshwa says ki आम्ही छत्रपती शिवाजी महाराजांचे followers आहोत. In his letter, he has mentioned it. Similarly, Gopal Rao Patwardhan, when the Nizam attacked Pune, burnt more than half of it in 1763, he writes a letter in which says that Thorल्या महाराजांनी मिळवलेलं राज्य, Thorle Maharaj म्हणजे जे Shivaji Maharaj, whatever he had earned, it appears as if it's all going to be extinguished with this kind of an attack which has taken place here. So that the memory of that man remained till, at least we have letters till 1763 and later on he had achieved, and what was the basis, the foundation of the pyramid that became the Maratha Empire later on.
That was definitely the inspiration for the 18th century Marathas, and some of his vision or dream were realized when the Maratha Empire actually did extend for a brief while all the way to Attock and to parts of Bengal. And his inspiration continues to be there today as well. But even if we were to go back, say, 100, 120 years, it was the primary source of inspiration for Lokmanya Tilak as well. So I think that goes without saying that how important Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj has been, not just for Maharashtra, but for India. And that I think people are finally realizing that right now, even beyond Maharashtra. One point I want to talk about Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj's era before we move a little forward chronologically. We talk about all these battles that he won. He won the Battle of Pratapgarh, the Battle of Sivagad, and so many other battles. The surgical strike on Shahiste Khan in Pune. And there are so many, right? And later on, much bigger battles at Salner, for example. You also come from a military background, from Navy. Can you talk about some of his strategies that later on were used very effectively in the 18th century by Baji Rao as well, before things changed a little bit later. But can you talk about what is it that Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj brought to the battlefield? What were his innovations? What were his strategies? How were they different from, and how did they surprise the enemy?
The first thing to win a battle must be an inspirational leader. And in that respect, Shivaji Raja used to lead the battles himself, though a few were delegated to his chiefs. He set an example to his men, and his men followed him wherever he ordered. You find similar parallels when you look at some of Baji Rao Peshwa's campaigns against the Nizam or in Delhi and so on. The second thing is that in the 17th century, you find that the large, huge armies with the big artillery was what the Mughals had. And against that, to come down onto the plains and fight a frontal battle was not always possible. And this persisted almost till Panipat. Until that time, the Marathas remained, they basically laid stress on a guerrilla kind of battle pattern. And it was not until artillery entered their armies that they changed the battle and began fighting frontal battles. So forts were very important in the 17th and the early 18th century. And it was keeping these forts under you that really helped you to attack the enemy when he was not expecting it, and then go back to the safety of your forts and then defend that fort for as long as you can. So that was one strategy which was very much used in 17th century. Later on, as the artillery improved, and especially in the late 18th centuries, and the British were fighting with it, the importance of Mughals as strongholds became a little less, because the artillery shells could reach the forts. The invincible forts like Raigad were taken in 1818 because the British could drag a cannon in an adjacent hill and fire onto Raigad and incessantly for several days. Climbing up the fort was next to impossible. So this change in the kind of battle, the patterns that took place over a period of time, which is natural. If you look at the 1965 battle which we had when it was a different, or in the Second World War, which was basically a tank battle. In the First World War, which was trench warfare. So every 20 years, if you have change in battle patterns, I'm sure in a period of 150 years, the kind of battles fought were different. Perception of mutual strengths and weaknesses also changed. So they had to be adjusted according to that.
Right. One point on Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj that you have talked about in one of the chapters is the campaign on Surat. And I think this brings up this dichotomy of, the Mughals obviously saying that he is looting Surat. And at that time, Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj puts out a very nice letter saying, you have oppressed us, you have stolen this from us, and I'm just taking it back. I think, can you briefly mention that?
This is an English factory letter,
right,
which is quoting what Chhatrapati Shivaji said at that time. He said, tell your king, that is Aurangazeb, he has attacked my people and forced me to wage war in my own defense, for which I have to maintain an army, and that army must be paid. So if you have waged a war against my people, I will take your wealth and pay for that army, to maintain that army. So that was the rationale which was given out for the attack on Surat, and that money was not used for any pleasure palaces.
Right.
It was built to strengthen and build a host of forts at that point.
Since we are talking about Surat, another point that you have mentioned, and it's an important point from a historical context, is I think there were 3 campaigns on Surat over 15 years. One important point that you mentioned in the book is the last campaign. After the last campaign, to put in modern terms, the British finally had it, and they actually decided to shift from Surat to Bombay, right? Yes. And I think that was sort of an important decision for them as well.
2 events happened almost at the same time. One was the handing over of Bombay by the Portuguese to them, and Shivaji Raja's attack on Surat twice. 1664 and 1670, and that 1670 attack kind of clinched it. That is not a place we can do business anymore, and that's how the commercial importance of Surat kind of declined, and the importance of Bombay started increasing from that point in time.
Let's come to the next important part that is covered in your book, and again, unfortunately, few people know about it. It's called as the 25-year war or the 27-year war, depending on how you count it. But after Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj's death in 1680. Aurangzeb invaded Deccan himself with the idea of finally finishing off what he couldn't for the previous decades. And he waged a long war across successive Maratha leaders. Chhatrapati Shivaji's son, the elder son, Chhatrapati Shambhaji Maharaj, then Chhatrapati Rajaram, and then the daughter-in-law, Maharani Tarabai. And in 27 years, Aurangzeb finally lost, and he ended up dying right here in the Deccan. He never went back. So in a sense, this was a 27-year war. I would say, in effect, one of the final wars between the Marathas and the Mughals, which the Mughals decisively lost with the death of Aurangzeb. I think this is something not talked about a whole lot. Can you briefly talk about that tumultuous era of those 27 years?
Actually, it is 25 years because he actually came down to the Deccan in 1682.
Okay.
So the reason he came down here at that time was, of course, he always had it, even when he was the viceroy of the Deccan, that he has to reach right up to the deep south, and he has to extinguish the kingdoms of Bijapur and Qutub Shah. That was always in his mind, and of course the Marathas, but he did not want to come there probably as long as Chhatrapati Shivaji was alive. When he came down in 1682, just before that, there was a battle between Durgadas Rathod of Jodhpur, along with his own son, Akbar, Aurangzeb's own son, Akbar, who had gone over to the Rajputs. And there was a battle at that point in time. And Aurangzeb was kind of trapped with a very small army. And at that point, had Akbar attacked him, that would have been the end of Aurangzeb, because with a smaller army, he would not have even faced it. So Aurangzeb used the device of sending letters to the Rajputs and to Akbar, hinting at there are going to be defections on the eve of the battle. When they got these letters, they thought they believed them. And that is why they abandoned the battle from a winning position. And after that, there was no place for Akbar to hide from his father, except the south. And that's why he came to the south and went to Chhatrapati Shivaji, who was the ruler at that time, and asked him for his help and his protection, and that let us both together combine and fight against my father. Aurangzeb had no choice but to come down to follow his son, the Deccan, because he could not leave a rebel son. He had seen what his own rebellion had done to his father.
Right.
And that's how he came here in 1682, and he began to fight with the Deccan Pass.
Right.
So that is where it began. And his armies were fighting on various fronts. Chhatrapati Shivaji was mostly fighting in the Konkan with the Portuguese and the Siddhi of Janjira, all those people who were oppressing the Hindu population of that region. So he was essentially fighting with them. In addition to that, the Mughals came down there. Now Aurangzeb first decided to focus on the Qutub Shahi and the Bijapur, and by 1687, both these kingdoms had been won over. Their rulers had been put in various prisons, and they died in the next 20 years in prison itself. And after that, 1687, he could focus his entire energy onto the Marathas. To his good fortune, he could capture Chhatrapati Shivaji in 1689, and then seeking to get control of the Maratha forts and the treasure, which Chhatrapati Shivaji had left a considerable treasure at the time of his death, to try to get. When he tried to obtain this and he could not get it, and that is when he put Chhatrapati Shivaji to a cruel death near Pune. And he thought that is my finest moment in victory, and now I have managed to extinguish all three powers. But unlike the Bijapur and Qutub Shahi kingdoms, which were basically dependent on the survival of the king, the Maratha power, to his own surprise, he found that he may remove the king, but the movement was so strong, the grassroots movement and the animosity against the invader was so strong that they could fight a battle against the Mughals without a leader, without a centralized kind of core which could pass on orders in a proper manner. People were taking the initiative, attacking Mughal camps. Nobody felt safe anymore. In the time of Santaji and Dhanaji, the Mughal trooper is said to have told his horse that, "Why aren't you drinking the water? Do you see Santaji and Dhanaji inside it?" So that was a fear which they had of the Maratha force, because the lightning fast moves, sudden attacks taking them by surprise. This was what was happening in those 25 years. At the same time, entire Maharashtra was devastated by war. 25 years, something that you see in so many countries today when they are faced with a long war. Something similar happened to Maharashtra at that time. And of course, at that time, there was a lot of religious oppression. Temples were destroyed. Only recently, there has been a document found of how he destroyed the temple of Pandharpur. So these kind of things were happening. In 1705, Stuart Gordon, who was one of the people who written about the Marathas, said that probably the Mughals probably lost the Deccan by 1705. And because the emperor used to go with his army, his demoralized and disheartened army, from fort to fort to try and capture it. Most of the forts were taken by paying some kind of a money. The forts were handed over. Immediately the emperor left that place, the fort was taken back by the Marathas. So this, in fact, I've heard some of the talks by historians in the past where they described the fort was handed over in exchange for money. The Mughals came and replenished it. They rebuilt it. They put their cannons and so on there. And then the Marathas one night went and surprised them and took back the forts in better state than what they had handed over.
Right.
So these kind of ironical situations arose until and his generals were not willing to fight. His wazir kept telling him, let's go back to the pleasure palaces of Delhi and Agra, which he would not. Until the year 1706, he finally fell ill, was taken to Ahmednagar where he died, and finally was buried in Kultabad near Aurangabad. So, and that momentum which the Marathas had gained in those 25-year war was such that they surged northwards after that. Already by the year 1700, people like Mahadji Shinde had crossed the Narmada and they were already in the Malwa region. So when Aurangzeb died and the succession battle began and the Mughal forces withdrew to the north, the Marathas began surging northwards. The next emperor, Bahadur Shah, he was a pacific man, he was an easygoing person, could not really impose himself on the entire subcontinent extending from Lahore to the deep south. And after his death in 1712, the Marathas surged forward, and by 1719, you find 30,000 Maratha troops are in Delhi, helping Hussain Ali to depose the emperor that time, Farrukh Siyar. So that's how it kind of...
Right, I think that whole era transformed extremely rapidly, and you have covered that in a lot of detail in your two books about Baji Rao, who lived from 1700 to 1740, and Nana Peshwa, who lived from 1720 to 1761. And that whole era essentially led to the peak of Maratha power towards the end of 1750s that we talk about. There's a lot more to talk about the book, and we have limited time, about 10-15 more minutes. I want to cover a few things for sure. We are not going to talk about Panipat and some of the other campaigns that have been covered in a lot of detail in your other books. But towards the end of 17th century, end of 1750s, it's important to highlight the Maratha campaign in Punjab when they extended all the way to Attock. I think that's one point I want to talk about. And then following Panipat, Madhavrao Peshwa, the way he recovered everything is very interesting. But again, that's a topic of your future books. So I'm not going to talk a lot about it. And then we want to talk about a few incidents and interesting sort of, non-typical history-related events and incidents towards the late part of 18th century. So that's how I would like to cover the next 15 odd minutes. So if you can briefly talk about Marathas in Punjab, essentially the late 1750s, when the Marathas were at their peak, the middle of 18th century, if you will. You can say that was the top moment of the Maratha century.
It was never planned that the Marathas enter the Punjab. Their entire interest was to keep control over Delhi and the surrounding areas. But having taken Delhi from Abdali's troops in 1758, there was a chief in the Jalandhar Doab called Adina Beg. Now, this man had variously served the Afghans at some point in time. He had tried to have his own independence at some point in time. And he did not get along with the Afghans general, Jahan Khan, who was at that time in Lahore with Ali's son, Taimur Shah. So, Adina Beg actually invited Mallarji Holkar and Raghunath Rao to come into the Punjab, and he said that for every day that you come here, I will pay for the expense of your troops. And that is what prompted Raghunath Rao and Mallara Holkar to enter the Punjab. They had some Mughal forces with them. They also had the Sikhs, but the Sikhs marched separately from the Marathas. And these three entered the Punjab. They captured a whole lot of places there practically quite easily. And seeing this army coming towards Lahore, Jahan Khan evacuated the city, crossed the river Ravi, and started moving towards Kabul. And before long, Lahore was captured. In fact, Mahadji Paigode is supposed to be the Maratha chief who actually entered Lahore, and there was a slave who was called Tehmas Khan who actually opened the gates of Lahore for Mahadji Paigode's contingent. And in September 1758, of course, Raghunath Rao was feted in the Shalimar Gardens there and so on. And then other Maratha troops along with some Mughal troops went as far as Multan and Attock and Peshawar. So this was all known, and they were holding these places for nearly 18 months after that. So that was the limit of Maratha expansion, as you can say, right up to Peshawar. Today, it seems to be unthinkable. Many people don't know about it.
Right.
And so that was really a kind
and
of...
at that time, there are some interesting letters that you have referenced, both in your earlier book and this book, about Raghunath Rao talking about potentially going even beyond.
Yes, Raghunath Rao at that point in time gets a letter from the Shah of Iran. And in fact, Abdali's nephew also comes to him. And Abdali's nephew is sent to Pune to meet Nana Sahib. And Nana Sahib says, okay, give him these parts to govern. And the Shah of Iran in his letter says that we have got Abdali's regions, Kabul and Kandahar, between our two paths. So you from the east and me from the west, let us both attack that region. You take Kabul and I will take Kandahar. And very loftily, Raghunath Rao is seen writing to the Peshwa. But I thought that why should we give away Kandahar to the Iranians? Because until 100 years back, it was part of India. It was part of the Mughal Empire.
That's an interesting correspondence. I think you have gotten into details around that in your book on Panipat. Let's move forward. Madhavrao era is very interesting, but I'll leave it for a separate discussion on your next book. The last 3-4 decades of the 18th century were very crucial, and many people at that time and many historians later on sort of wrote off the Marathas after Panipat or after Madhavrao. But what we need to realize, and your book really highlights that very well, and I think your future book will do that Marathas continued to be the prominent power till 1802, 1803, till the Second Anglo-Maratha War. And this, especially last 30 years, was made possible by two extremely important leaders. And they were not the Peshwas, but they were very important leaders. They were Nana Phadnavis and Mahadji Shinde. And you have talked about them extensively in multiple chapters. I think it will be important if you can talk briefly about both of these leaders and what they meant and what they were able to achieve amidst all the internal and external challenges.
Actually, Nana Phadnavis began his career in 1756-57. He was probably a year or two older than Madhavrao, 3 years older than Madhavrao. And when his father died, he took over as the Phadnavis. But his real grooming, though he was older than Madhavrao, happened during the Madhavrao years. The letters exchanged between Madhavrao and Nana Sahib and Nana Phadnavis show how much of an influence Madhavrao had on Nana Phadnavis. So the administration, the principles, the morals, the efficiency was imparted to Nana Phadnavis in Madhavrao's time. And even the strictness toward an approach towards any issue which comes up before them. In the Scindias actually lost a lot of their family in the 1750s, right up to Panipat. And for about 3 or 4 years after Panipat, their house was in a kind of a state of flux. Until 1766, Madhavrao made Mahadji the chief of the Scindias. And that was a very year when Mallarji Holkar died and Ahilya Devi became the head of the Holkar family and Tukoji became the head of the military wing. So that was a state of change which took place around in 1760. But from 1766, you find Mahadji gaining in stature, not just as a soldier. I mean, first thing, he was lame after he came back from Panipat because of an injury sustained during the course of his journey. But the stature as a statesman and as a strategician, he could bring to bear much more than just an army on the battlefield. But that was his main USP, I would say. In 1772, after the death of Madhavrao and the following year when Narayan Rao was assassinated, you find the top of the Maratha Shahi kind of completely in tatters. And that is a period we call the Uttar Peshwai. It is practically the end of the Peshwa as a governing officer of the Maratha power. Because the next Peshwa was just 40 days old when he was appointed as a Peshwa. And all central administrative power went to Nana Phadnavis. And in the north, it was either Mahadji Shinde or Tukoji Holkar. In the south, it was the Patwardhans. It was Haripant Phadke. And these leaders actually took over the military aspect of the empire, on whom Nana Phadnavis exercised control in the name of the Peshwa. So about Nana, it's very often said in Marathi, Sharthi ne Rajya Rakhle, because there were tremendous challenges. The civil war between Raghunath Rao and Madhavrao Peshwa, followed by the assassination of Narayan Rao, followed by the Anglo-Maratha War for 8 years, the battles with Tipu and Hyder Ali in the south, with the Nizam, with the north, the British trying to attack Pune in 1779 and given a bloody nose at that point in time. So then Delhi itself was taken over by the Rohillas. Najib-ud-Dawla was the dictator of Delhi for a good 7 or 8 years until 1769, Madhavrao sent the army back. And it was only in the 1771 onwards that the Marathas actually exercised control over Delhi through the forces of Mahadji Shinde. Except for a small blip when Najib-ud-Dawla's grandson, Gulab Qadir, kind of found the opportunity to enter the Red Fort, blind the emperor, and kind of unspoken atrocities against the Mughal royals. Until then, except for that 1 year period, you find that Mahadji practically is in control of Delhi for a continuous period of, he and his adopted son Daulat Rao, for a continuous period of 3 decades until 1803. So that period for 30 years from 1773 to 1803 was the rule of these important people who actually helped to sustain the Maratha power.
I mean, I think there's a lot to be discussed specifically about Nana Phadnavis as well. But there's one point or one quote that you have given in the book by, I think, a British historian or an army officer, really questioning. I think it's in one of your other references. I don't know if it's produced in this book, but really questioning that the Maratha Empire that created so many leaders. We also talked about the 25 or the 27-year war, when even after the deaths of 2, 3 Chhatrapatis, there were so many leaders. And that continued for 100 years. But somehow after Nana Phadnavis in 1800, new leaders didn't come up. And that eventually led to the end of the empire in the next 2 decades. What happened there? I think that's a question that
For
was
one,
asked.
the spirit of nationalism which prevailed in the 17th century, because you are fighting with an oppressor. When you're fighting against an oppressor, there is a spirit of nationalism. People voluntarily go out and fight, and then they start fighting for territory, for their own particular fiefs, for their own empires which they control. Then they want money, they want power. All these motivations are there. I mean, we are all human beings, and they were human beings at that point in time. I don't believe in glorifying somebody as without any virtues. Everybody has got a gray side of it. So at one point in time, we find that the number of mercenaries entering the Maratha army kept on increasing over the 18th century. And finally, it came to this, that in 1803 was the last real battle which the Marathas, 1803, 1805 with the Holkars, that the British fought. And during that time, you find that most of the captains of the Maratha army were Europeans. They were the people who were technically qualified. If a half-breed uh, European comes asking for a job, it was assumed that he had better technical know-how than a local person, and he was paid more. So you find that unless you have technological backup of what you're trying to achieve, whether it's in the army or your progressive look at your administration, you are finally a feudal power who was fighting with a corporate entity, where not necessary that the person who was last in power, his son will come and take over from him. It will be another person chosen because of his abilities who comes there and takes over. So the meritocracy in governance, meritocracy on the battlefield started coming into the East India Company, while similar changes did not take place. We were still fighting amongst ourselves without imagining there was a wolf at the door. And because of our own battles, at any point in time, we might lose our own house to that person.
Right.
So it is wonderfully discussed about the South Asian military economy in the book we have both read by Randolph Cooper, of how people did not realize when they are serving the British that they are actually giving away their land to a foreign power.
Right.
And
Right.
the same mistake was done by the Marathas, who didn't realize that except for Nana Phadnavis, who was warning them
Right.
that they will take over your country.
Right. No, that's a great book. We had a great conversation with Professor Randolph Cooper earlier this year. And for listeners, that's available on YouTube, and I've tweeted about it multiple times. I'll do it again when I tweet about this particular session. I would say we have about 10 more minutes. Now, there are some non-battlefield, non-strategy things that I wanted to talk about. Let's talk about the life in the 18th century. And you have talked about multiple incidents, multiple vignettes in the book. There's a reference about the gardens of Pune, the temples of Pune, the Kashi Yatra of that era. You mentioned about Sawai Madhavrao, Peshwa's wedding, and the detailed planning and how do you greet the guests and how do you plan for various activities. That's been described in great detail. And then there is the unfortunate and bizarre and crazy mercenary war in a temple, the Khunya Murlidhar incident. So there are a lot of these interesting vignettes that are really not directly related to the history, but give you an interesting peek of what life was in 18th century India, in 18th century Maharashtra, 18th century Pune. I know we can have a long discussion, but can you talk about some of these briefly for about 10 minutes?
The Maratha period, the later part, you find that they become aware of what they are creating. They have created an empire, and from Nana Sahib Peshwa's time, there was certain stability which came. And there's a wonderful letter by Nana Sahib which was written around 1742 or 43, where after his campaign to Bundelkhand and Malwa, he comes away very much impressed by the way people live in the north, the way they lay out their gardens, the way they have their palaces, the way they have learned discourses amongst themselves, so all these things influenced him, and he writes about that in his letter to Nana Purandare, which is there in my book on Nana Sahib. He had a vision of what his capital city ought to be like, and he started building Pune as a capital city sometime in the 1740s, and to the extent he could. For example, there was a problem with the water supply of Pune, and you find that Nana Sahib's grandmother actually, Radhabai, she said that the people of Pune are not getting sufficient drinking water. And there are people here who are influential people who have gardens of their own, who are taking away all the water from the river. And I cannot stand it that people don't get drinking water. So I've stopped the water to the gardens so that people get drinking water. To which a counter letter was sent by these influential nobles to Nana Sahib, who was in Satara, that how can she do such a thing, and our gardens and our trees will all dry up. That was the kind of the beginning of the plan to create a water supply system for Pune. So you see those two big lakes today, about 10 kilometers from Shanwarwada, 10, 15 kilometers at Kathraj, at the hills, and one is at a higher level, one is at a lower level. There's an elaborate filtration system for that water to come to the lower tank. And there is a brickwork,
underwater duct,
underground tunnels
with
brickwork on the sides, which carry that water right up to various public houses or public tanks, which people could access right up to the Shaniwarwada. In fact, there's an 1851 map which I have published in this book, which shows a water line which enters the Shanwarwada. Even today, you can see that tower. That tower is right next to the Nanawada, from where the water line comes inside. So this underground water supply system was initiated during Nana Sahib Peshwa's time. Then again, he found that there's a temple of Parvati where people are supposed to get cured when they go to visit that place. So his mother was cured of her leg ailment when she went there. So he decided to build some temples over there. So along with his own palace, and finally he died there. So that is Parvati is another place which you hear of. Then right from the early 17th century, before the Peshwa period, there was this system of rewarding educated people. In those days, it was the Brahmins who were literate, and they were being rewarded by a Dakshina in the month of Shravan. And that Dakshina system was initially managed by the Dabadis. And after 1734, when Baji Rao defeated the Dabadi, it came to the Peshwa. And from then on, the Ramana was the place. Ramana was a place next to Shanwarwada, where you have a school today called Raman Bagh. So there was a structure built there where these Brahmins used to come, and depending on their learning and their expertise, they were given Dakshina. Soon that place became very small because the number of people coming in kept increasing every year. So he built a new Ramana at the base of the Parvati, which is a huge structure. Only a wall remains there today, and the Ganpati temple at the center of it remains today. So these are the things. Then the zoo was established in the later part, which was the Peshwa Park, which was later on moved towards Kathraj and renamed as the Rajiv Gandhi Zoo. A lot of improvements, like there's a canal running next to the Shanwarwada, which is diverted towards the river. I mean, those days it was a major engineering work to divert a canal from the river about 3 kilometers upstream. Artificial lake was created around the Sarasbagh temple. A palace was built on its shores, from which steps leading there, the boats. There are pictures of Mahadji, Shinde and Sawai Madhavrao actually going on those lakes in their boats and those kind of. So that was a kind of city that was being developed here. And I would say the Maratha Renaissance came a little late, almost 120 years after they began their rule. And unfortunately, it ended very soon after that. And
I mean, just when the Renaissance was starting, the power ended. So it did really, I mean, one of your books that I didn't mention, it's not exactly a history book, but it's a great book, the book about the James Whale's paintings that Dr. Kulkarni has written. That's an amazing book that gives you an interesting art painting speak of that era. And I mean, 1790s was I think Renaissance is the right word. Yeah. I mean, there were these examples that you're given of how a young Sawai Madhavrao Peshwa was getting things like a new telescope from Europe and using it to do some astronomy from atop Shanwarwada, and all these things were happening, and then suddenly everything ended in the next 10, 20 years. I mean, is there anything that you can briefly talk about the Khunya Murlidhar episode? It's a weird episode, and you have dedicated an entire chapter for it, and it just sort of summarizes the craziness of that era, because you have mercenaries on two sides, the British and the Arab mercenaries fighting in front of a temple. It's just bizarre.
Today you hear of militias in Afghanistan. Yeah. So those days every private chief of his own had his own militia. So there was an American captain called Boyd, who had a small group of people. He had his own militia. The Arabs mercenaries had their own militia. And just when this temple was about to be consecrated, a fight broke out between the two of them outside the temple, and people were kind of killed, and a lot of bloodshed took place, and about you first references to this temple being called Khunya Murlidhar, or the murderous Murlidhar, appear about 15 years after that event, when it was called by the lay public that because so much blood was shed outside that. So it's an interesting episode which shows that gradually a kind of lawlessness was beginning to creep in. And finally, that was what actually brought
Right.
down.
And the different militia who were fighting amongst each other more than anything else, right? I think towards the end, we probably won't go into details of it, but you have a chapter on Trimbakji Dengale that again very few people know. I mean, again, many people in history assume that Baji Rao II signed the surrender in June of 1818, and that was the end of Maratha resistance. But it did continue in pockets for at least another decade or more. And Trimbakji Dengale was one such example, and there were a few others. I think it's important to highlight them. We probably won't cover them in great detail. But as I said at the beginning, I think this book does cover a variety of different. If you look at all the chapters, of course, there's some really nice paintings in here as well. But it's covering about 35-40 chapters of these 160, 170 years. And it's remarkable in a sense that, you have such a complex era, such an interesting era. And on one hand, Dr. Kulkarni has written a 700-page book on a 20-30-year period. And now you have to summarize 170 years in 300 pages. And he's managed to do that very effectively. So sort of give both extremes to the reader, depending on what you're interested in. Right. So any closing comments, Dr. Kulkarni?
Yeah, actually,
I think we probably should have more discussion on some of these independent vignettes.
There are a few documents which I had with me, and
Right.
I decided to publish them in this book finally because, like, for example, the will of Madhavrao Peshwa, written down in Nana Phadnavis' own handwriting. I have that entire 10 points of that will. And then, so I put an excerpt of that here. Or Nana Phadnavis was reputed to have several crores of rupees.
Yeah,
in
the
assets.
Naukot Nana reference.
Yes, so the chapter on Naukot Nana gives the original letter written by Nana in his own handwriting about the disbursal of 5 crores 19 lakh rupees. So that letter has been published for the first time. Then Raghunath Rao, when he was in the English camp, what was the impression of James Forbes, who was the chaplain there, in extenso? I mean, that quote I have given extenso. What was his impression about Raghunath Rao, his cabinet, Anandibai, and so on. Again, about Ram Shastri and about Anandibai's Dhasama. Then the Bakhar of Narayan Rao Peshwa's assassination. Again, part of it has been published here for the first time. It's about 16 pages, but I have published only the relevant portions which are related to his murder. Trimbakji Dengale, of course, the documents which were there have not been published before. How he was taken into custody after 1818, how he was transported to Chunar on the Ganges near Kashi, how he spent his last few years there. The British have been so careful that they even have a list of the inventory that was found with him after his death and how they were auctioned, the entire amount. The expenses of the proceeds from that auction were used for his funeral, and finally they had 5 rupees left, which was remitted to the government treasury. Those records you can access even today. So all that has been published in this book.
I think that's great. I think there's just so much documentation to look at. Just go through the list of the chapters. And one good thing I would tell the readers is you can read pretty much any chapter in any order, assuming you have some idea of the chronology. But you don't need to read this book in a strict chronological fashion, because these are independent standalone chapters. We didn't talk about, obviously there's good reference to the 3 Anglo-Maratha wars as well in this chapter, in this book. There is a chapter on Kashi Yatra, how Kashi and Prayag were so important to the Marathas, and how at various points they tried to get control over them, how some of the royal or some of the senior members.
Kashi, the Maratha involvement extended for a good part of 80 years. From
Right.
Baji Rao Peshwa the first, you have documents where he sends money, his mother goes there, then his wife goes there. So from that time onwards, in the 1730s, right up to second Baji Rao's time, if you go to the Kalabhairav Mandir in Kashi today, there is a plaque, there is a Shilalekh behind the temple, which mentions Baji Rao II and the then Emperor Chhatrapati Shahu II. That is after 1811 almost. So until that point in time, the Marathas were involved in Kashi, and they were sending money to build temples, build ghats, and so on. So the Bhosle Ghat, the Shinde Ghat, the Raja Ghat, the Peshwa Ghat, the
The whole
Ganesh Ghat, they are all Maratha Ghats even today.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
Dashashwamedh
Right.
Ghat.
Yeah, so I think that, I mean, you pick up any chapter and you can read it. So I think, unfortunately, we are running out of time. We are already out of time. I would like to thank Dr. Kulkarni one more time. He and I have these kind of conversations all the time, and it's always great to discuss history with him. And I mean, we can literally go on for hours. Our challenge is to see if we can do this in 1 hour for these Bharatvaarta and other discussions, right? I would also like to wish Dr. Kulkarni all the best for his next project. He is, as he's announced on Twitter, he's working on his next detailed book on Peshwa Madhavrao, which is going to be very, very interesting because, again, less people know about him, especially outside of Maharashtra compared to, say, Baji Rao. And there's a very, I'll leave with this one quote that will give you a complete summary of, in a sense, of that book. Again, it's by I believe it's by Grant Duff, one of the first British historians to write about Marathas. And he says the plains of Panipat were no more, I'm not quoting verbatim, but no more as dangerous or as fatal to the Marathas as was the death of this young prince. And Madhavrao took over at age 16 after Panipat and died at age 28 from tuberculosis, right? And contrary to what many people will lead you to believe, so Panipat was definitely not the end of the Marathas. Madhavrao resurrected it brilliantly in the next 10 years. And then, as we discussed, Mahadji, Scindia, and Nana Phadnavis and some of the other leaders continued to take it further, at least for the next 50 years. But would like to close on this. This book is available on Amazon.in. If you're in Pune, you can try to contact Dr. Kulkarni and see if you can get a signed copy as well. So once again, thanks a lot, Dr. Kulkarni, and thanks Bharatvaarta as always for allowing us to have this discussion. Thank you and have a good day.
Thanks a lot for having me over.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Bharatvaarta podcast. If you want to see more content like this, then don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We started Bharatvaarta to facilitate long-form discussions on politics, policy, and culture. We don't necessarily endorse anything that was said in this episode. If you wish to offer us feedback, do reach out to us on social media. We are at Bharatvaarta on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You could also get in touch with us on our website, www.bharatvaarta.in. The links are in the description below. Until next time, stay safe, take care, and Jai Hind.